Welcome back, Wizard. I got a scope to show you today that's just nuts, and it just blends these two ridiculous technologies. Today we'll be taking a look at the all-new thermal Pulsar DUO XP50. And it's pretty nuts when you're scanning, and you can see in both visual and thermal. It's just super cool. I'll show it to you. Let's get to it. So as I said, we're gonna be looking at a very unique scope that can do some really cool stuff in like the multispectral, like being able to see in both the visual and the thermal spectrum. Now though, I'm gonna be throwing around all sorts of numbers and stats all about this unit. So I highly recommend you watch either our primer or Hop's primer on thermal optics so you can understand what the heck we're talking about. And then you're buying the features that you need. And then you're not wasting money on the features that, you don't need. But I'll do you a favor and I'll link to those primers down in the description so you can check those out also. And I also want to say big thanks to Pulsar for letting us borrow this amazing optic so we can show off this technology to you. All right, with all that out of the way, let's talk about what the heck the Pulsar DUO XP50 even is and what makes it so unique in terms of the technology that it has all packed in here. The Pulsar DUO has two video modes, as implied by duo in the name. The DUO can see in the standard visual spectrum with a 4K full color sensor, and then flip to a 640 by 480 sensor in the thermal spectrum, allowing the user to swap back and forth between thermal and visual, or have a picture-in-picture of the two different viewing spectrums. And for hunting, it's pretty nuts to have this whole multi-spectrum thing going on, because then you're looking out into a field and you're seeing things in both the visual and the thermal at the same time. Or just like click a button and have the full view and like normal visual switch over to full thermal. It's pretty nuts. But let's go backwards a bit and let's tear into it and let's see if it's actually any good and walk through it all and talk through all the technology. So instead of doing a full unboxing though, I'll just move through it kind of quickly and show you all kind of what all you get with it instead.
All right, so here's our actual box for the Thermion DUO. First thing we open up, we have some kind words from Pulsar. You can pause here if you want to read that. Super nice. But let's see what else comes with it. First, looks like a bunch more instructions. Now, I do want to say, yeah, this is the quick start guide. Looks like it's pretty thick for a quick start guide. Make sure you go through this and know how it works. We are 100% not going to go through every single feature on this because there's a ton of stuff. But make sure you go through this if you go to own this and go through the manual. Like, look at all that. Yep, we're not going to review all that. So instead, I'll just show you the main stuff, starting here with the bag that it all comes in. So it is nice that it has a nice little carrying case for everything. Let me show you everything you get though. First thing is our battery. This is the smaller battery, like a 2000 milliamp hour battery. I think you can get a bigger one too. And then what is this one? Oh, okay. This is the actual, just a wall charger for it. That means there must be a USB cable in here somewhere too. And what's this one? Oh, it looks like this is where you can actually plug in the two batteries so you can quick charge them instead of having to do like one at a time on the rifle. So that's nice. Here is the actual cap. So this is the smaller cap for the smaller battery, but you can get the taller cap for the bigger battery, obviously. See, it just all pairs together. So yeah, pretty obvious stuff if you're wondering how all that works. But going back, no, don't do the scope yet. What is this one? Oh, it looks like the eyepiece cover. You really need this if you're using it during the daytime so that you don't have like an overpowered view, like you can actually see the display. Cleaning cloth, we 100% don't need more of those. USB cable, this is on loan. I'd probably just leave this in here. I have like a million more USB cables, so we'll just leave that. And then we have the actual scope itself. Let's get this out for now. And nothing else in there.
So that's all the different things you get when you order it, but let's look at this scope up close and let's see all the different features of the actual scope and how it actually operates. Looking at the Pulsar DUO XP50, its first cool feature is that it looks like a normal scope. Starting at the rear, we have the scope diopter with a nice rubberized ring. The diopter is smooth in its adjustment, but never feels like it would move on its own. Now the diopter is how you get that like clean and crisp image, so don't skip this step and then come back later and complain that the view's all blurry or something. Moving up the scope, we see the dual spectrum display controls. The top right is obvious as it's the record button, and the top left cycles through the zoom modes. And then we have the bottom button that flips between the thermal and visual displays. It gets a little more complicated though, so make sure you spend the time to familiarize yourself with the controls before you go out and use it on a hunt, because you can do some pretty tricky things with it. such as holding down the swap button turns on the picture-in-picture with the two different visual spectrums, but holding down the zoom button turns on the picture-in-picture within the same visual spectrum. And the picture-in-picture. Now, one thing I noticed is that when you actually go to zoom in with the picture-in-picture enabled, that it only zooms in the top like picture-in-picture view. It doesn't zoom in the whole screen. And using that at the range, you have like this little tiny zoomed in image on the screen. It's just pretty difficult to use. So what I found, it was just a ton easier to just swap between the full screen visual modes and just skip the whole picture-in-picture altogether. Back on our scope though, the top turret hides our removable battery. Here we have our 2000 milliamp hour battery, but you can also install the larger 3200 milliamp hour battery with the larger cap. On the left side where our parallax would be, we have our menu control knob. You press on the button on the side and use the knob to move through the various selections. And sitting behind the rifle, like being able to reach up and then press the button and turn the knob, it makes a fairly fast way to be able to go through all the different settings and change things as you're sitting there. I do wish that control knob just changed the thermal modes natively though. That would be pretty cool to just be flipping through them all. Moving up, we have our main visual optic housing with this flip to side cover. Atop the main lens is our power button and thermal lens that is open and closed at the front with this unlocking and locking control. And when you eventually turn it on and you're super mad that you can't see anything in thermal, because it's bound to happen, just remember that you probably forgot to open that thermal aperture. And one nice thing is that setting up the scope is easy as it's a standard 30mm mount. I used a worn X scale with the QD mount to get everything set up. Now, I use the QD mount version simply because I swap out a ton of optics, but if I was going to keep this optic dedicated to this rifle, I'd probably save a little bit of money and just use the standard worn X scale mount. And then it would have even less weight and be a little bit more secure. All right though, now that we have it all set up and you've kind of learned about it, let's go over all the different like stats and everything so that you can know all the different technologies that are at play in both the thermal and the visual side of this whole scope setup. First, we have the 4K visual sensor that feeds into the 1080 display. This higher tier visual sensor allows a user to zoom in and still have some really good clarity. Using our 16x max zoom, we can see we still have a lot of detail out to 300, but it is starting to get a bit pixelized. Swapping to thermal, we have a 640 by 480 sensor, and this is similar to the previous thermal optics we've seen from Pulsar in the other reviews we've done. And as we've seen in the past, those 640 by 480 sensors are super impressive, but once you start to zoom into that 4x or that 8x range, things start to be pretty hard to make out as to what the heck you're looking at. And I won't lie, we tried the 16x, and sometimes it felt like we were just picking which block of pixels to shoot at. So like a reference to give you is that thermal sensor is about a quarter of the resolution of that beautiful 4K image that you have in the visual spectrum. Is that right? Half would be 2K, and then another half would be 1K. No, it's another half of that. So you're starting to see the limits of the technology as the thermal sensor is actually 1/8 of the resolution of the visual display. Moving on with the specs though, the NETD of the Pulsar DUO is also rated to 25 millikelvin, which places the thermal sensitivity in the excellent category, making it easy for the device to detect very minor changes in thermal signature. As we mentioned, both the thermal and visual spectrums allow for a digital zoom to 1x, 2x, 4x, 8x, and 16x. Now, for thermal though, I want to note that the focus is controlled by the side slider that moves the focus of the thermal image closer and further. And this is one that you kind of gotta like set and forget. I set it to like 200 yards and then I just left it alone. But if you had a bunch of closer targets and you were in the thermal spectrum, you would need to like reach out in front of you and jockey with these controls to get the actual focus of those targets set out in front of you. And I just want you to be aware that it's a little tricky to be looking through the scope in the prone and then try to reach all the way up here and mess with the thermal focus. So that thermal focus could probably be in a better place to make it easier to get to, but I'm sure it's placed here due to where all the lenses are and everything else. But let's keep moving, and next let's look at all the different menus and all the different stuff inside the actual device. Now in the past it's taken me forever to show you all the different menu functions, and this one is just jam-packed. So instead I'm just gonna kind of show you all the different features that it has and all the information, so then you can just pause the video and just compare them or see if it has whatever you want. I recognize that I like the menus and all the technical stuff, but you may hate that. First, we can access the quick menu with the fast tap of the side scope button. This allows for contrast, brightness, or changing to other user settings. And I don't really ever use the quick settings, and as I said before, it would be way cooler to be able to just change or cycle through all the thermal modes instead of getting to whatever those controls are. Now though, if you want to get to the actual real controls, you just hold down the button for like 3 seconds. And here's the menu stuff for the Pulsar Duo if you want to look this over before you purchase. I'll put each feature and a little bit of what each one does. Yay! And just like that, we're through all the menus. All joking aside though, just hit me up in the comments if you have questions or want to know how something operates before you go to purchase one of these. Next though, let's review all the storage and connections of the Pulsar Duo. The Pulsar Duo doesn't include a memory card, but instead has a 16GB internal storage system. The internal memory and charge system is accessed via the USB-C connection on the right dial of the scope. You know, the windage, but not really a windage knob. The connection is under the cap where your windage knob would be. You'll see, I just always forget that it's there when I'm looking around for where to plug things in. Next though, let's look at all the special features of this device. The biggest claim to fame of the Pulsar Duo is probably the obvious one with the dual thermal and video spectrum imaging. Setting your view to thermal and visual picture-in-picture can add an element to target identification that you just couldn't do with a single device. And I guess it would go under special features. The scope itself is rated to a rifle recoil of like 6,000 joules. And I'm telling this to the people who don't even want to hear about menus, so I don't know why I'm including this. But to give you some frame of reference, like a 308 is about 3,500 joules. And if some nice person in the comments can help me out and let me know what exactly 6,000 joules is in terms of rifle caliber. All right, for our next category, let's get into battery and battery life. The Duo actually uses 2 batteries, an internal 4,900 milliamp hour battery pack and a quick swappable 2,000 milliamp hour battery. This means the user could carry additional batteries and swap them out or connect in a battery pack into the side windage control USB slot. And the time listed for like the internal and the 2,000 milliamp hour battery, like that combination, is listed as about 6 hours. And we did a full range day and we ran out kind of right as the day was ending. So I'd say those numbers were about right. But I think we could have gotten a lot more time out of it if we would have used like the standby mode when we weren't actually using the scope. But glassing on a long hunt, even in using just that visual spectrum, you're gonna need some batteries or at least some way to recharge them. All right, moving to the next category of color patterns, we see the same Pulsar thermal colors that were in our previous devices with the white hot, black hot, red hot, I like the red hot, red monochrome, rainbow, ultramarine, rainbow's better than ultramarine, violet, and sepia. And we went over all the different visual spectrums in more detail in the primer if you want some more information about each one of those. So, good grief! That's all the actual bits about this device. Now let's actually go out to the range and try it out. But there is one more slightly tricky bit, zeroing it. Now it's not tricky, but zeroing is a tad interesting as the visual and thermal sensors are not directly in line, meaning you need to zero the thermal and visual reticles differently. And this is why when you see me flip between the 2 different spectrums, like when you see me flip between the actual visual and thermal, the reticle moves just a little bit. And that's because those 2 different cameras aren't actually in line and have 2 different zeros. So you're gonna see that reticle change position just a little bit. Now, it's actually really easy to zero as you bore sight and then take a shot. The Duo then allows you to freeze the screen where you were aiming. Now, don't freeze it where your bullet hit. Don't do that. Freeze where you were aiming and then move the reticle to the impact of your round and voila, you're all zeroed. And I said it's tricky because it's different than what we're used to, but it's really that easy to zero. Well, technically you gotta do it in the visual and the thermal, but it's pretty simple to just do it in like 2 shots and have them both lined up. All right, now we're all zeroed and ready to go ahead and start doing some shooting. We went ahead and set out some steel at 300 and we just started there. Here you can see the black hot thermal image with the visual picture-in-picture up on top. Taking this shot was hard to see since I was looking through that tiny picture-in-picture screen. I took another shot thinking I was off, but actually, when we realized I was right on the first shot. I was certainly having difficulty focusing on the tiny screen though. I ended up swapping the views around to try and get a better focus on where the heck I was aiming, and then I zoomed in on the target at 16x. And ended up hitting the top left shoulder on that one. And it looks like I'm more zeroed than I thought with another follow-up hit. Now, visual wasn't too tricky once I finally flipped over to like the full screen mode, but the thing we're starting to see here is even out to 300 with that 16x zoom, like even in the visual spectrum view, that the picture itself is getting kind of hard to make out exactly what you're looking at. Now, though, as we mentioned before, the thermal sensor is 1/8 of the resolution, so let's swap over to thermal and see what we can do next. Flipping over here, seeing the target is far more difficult, but I think it's because it's not a different temperature than the surroundings. I did my best to eyeball it, but missed the first shot. I can't seem to really get my bearings on where the target is, and looks like I missed the second shot. Next, we leaned into the technology of the optic and began to flip back and forth from visual to thermal to get a better understanding of where we were aiming at in the thermal spectrum. Then, once we got all lined up, we started to get some hits. Then I let my buddy Dan try, and he definitely had to spend some time getting acclimated to that thermal view also. And you can see that here where he spent some time flipping the views back and forth also to get his bearing on the target in the thermal view.
I'll just get my bearings straight.
But, unlike me, he got it on the first try. And then he did another view flip to verify his position and hit it again on the second shot. So we wanted to be able to add some sort of thermal signature to the target so we can see it and like differentiate it from other things. So we found one of those like hot hands packets and we just taped it to the front of the actual target. So here you can see the hot hands in the visual spectrum just taped to the front of the target. When we flip over to thermal now, we can see a dark streak down the center of the target that we can aim at. And I should note that's almost a full IPSC target, and we have that hot hand just like stretched all the way across it. So you can see in the thermal spectrum that looking out to 300 in 16x zoom is pretty difficult to use. Now, the hot hands did give us a much better reference point to align our reticle to though. But even then, we couldn't really tell if we were exactly in the right space on the target. We lined up again and got a piece of the target. Then we sent another one and, well, we hit the hot hands packet. With the hot hands gone, we had to flip back again to the visual to be able to recenter ourselves on the target position, but it still wasn't easy to see and make a solid reference. And we thought, maybe it would help to just switch to a different color spectrum instead of using black hot the whole time. But wow, this is just a ton worse. Here you can see our actual chatter when we moved over to this.
No, not a shot. Oddly enough, the plate is cooler than everything around it.
Does that make sense? No?
No, like the wood is like a blue, and then there's like a yellow in front of it. It tells me the ground is really warm, and then there's like yellow, and then goes real bright red off to the left of it.
The rainbow spectrum just doesn't give you enough pixel fidelity to even allow my brain to make sense of what I'm looking at. Here, I'll zoom us back out, and you can see the 100-yard and 200-yard berms, and you can compare the image fidelity as we get to closer ranges. Well, trying to reach out with it was definitely interesting, but I think it would be just a ton easier if I was using actual live targets. But let's move into pros and cons, and the first pro is probably the obvious one, having those swappable visual and thermal views. The Duo just sets itself apart by having multi-spectrum technology that other scopes just can't touch, allowing you to have a single scope that can see in both thermal and visual when you're panning around a field. And this scope really alleviates the need to have like a full thermal scope upper setup and then a regular optic setup. You could just have them both in one. And having them both combined is just huge, as you can scan in the thermal spectrum, then swap to the visual to see your target in higher fidelity. And it really just gives this simple spot and shoot capability to the user. All right, though, the next pro I want to talk about is the swappable batteries. The battery is the Achilles heel of so many thermals, so having swappable batteries is a game changer when you're out in the field for long durations. And not having to worry about how much time you have left on your thermal scope is just huge when you're out in the field, You could just pull out another battery and just plug it in and still be ready to go. All right, so the next pro is actually the 4K performance of this scope. With such a high tier 4K sensor, you get some pretty good performance out of the visual spectrum side of the scope, allowing you to really zoom in at some crazy distances for a digital setup and make some great shots. 600 yards on the visual side was possible, but it started to really show off the limitations of digital versus a conventional scope. Now, the highs of the visual spectrum leads me into some of the cons of this device, and the first one I want to talk about is that limitation of the thermal sensor and kind of the distance you can get with it. During our time, shots at 300 were pretty difficult, and it often seemed like we were zooming in on a single pixel, even with our hot hands on the target. The effective range of the thermal seemed more like 200 yards with that 640 by 480 sensor. And it's kind of like that proton thermal add-on that we did. I'll link to that one up here if you want to see some more of that. But we kind of reached that same range, like that 200 yards, and I think it's kind of just the limit of that 640 sensor. And I really want you to take this home with you because it's really more of a sensor, like resolution issue, not really like a proton or a duo issue. That 640 sensor just doesn't have enough resolution to punch out any further than about 200. Now, my last con that I'll mention is solvable with the swappable batteries, but you're gonna need a lot of power. With both your visual and thermal sides of your scope drawing on internal battery power, you're gonna need an extra battery or battery pack with you on long hunts. And you're gonna need to have some sort of solar setup or a bunch of rechargeable packs if you're gonna try to recharge everything and go shoot again like the next night or something. So what are my thoughts on the Pulsar Duo then? Well, I think the Pulsar Duo is a great choice if you're looking for a single rifle scope setup that allows you to look in the visual and thermal spectrums, allowing the hunter to make extremely rapid target identification and engagement. Now though, and I'll be impressed if you stayed to the end for this actually fairly important note, I didn't find that it gave me a really big advantage at night, like the visual spectrum would just be black. And I found that was the time when I needed the visual spectrum the most to make the most sense out of what the heck I was looking at in the thermal spectrum. So Pulsar, what about a Pulsar Trio? If you make one of those, I definitely want one. But I hope this review of the Pulsar DUO XP50 was useful in your purchasing decisions. I want to say thanks to all of our Patreon supporters and all of our YouTube members. You're the ones that make it possible to see all this crazy cool technology and show it off to you. And I want to say thanks to everyone that likes, comments, and subscribes. Comment down below what you think about having a scope with multi-spectrum, or if you like a normal everyday scope. All right, everyone, Walsh out. You can't see it, but I put the rifle down here on the ground, and as I was walking away, I almost just tripped over it. If you look back, you probably see it. Oh, and you definitely have to use, and the eyepiece is magnetic? I didn't ever notice. I know we had a huge missed opportunity with taking this out on a hunt, but it just didn't work out. So maybe we can see some other cooler stuff from Pulsar in the future and actually do some cool stuff with it. All right, seriously, go away.